Right, we'll get going, shall we? Evening all. I know from the chat box already. There's already an international feel to who's on, so that's fantastic. As you can probably see on your screen, what we've got is some scenarios, just as a little taster and arrival activity, just to prompt the start of some conversations first before we introduce the theme for the webinar and go through it. So all we'd like you to do is take a look at those scenarios and choose one or two and just think about maybe making a few notes or having some thoughts about what you might do in that situation. And then once you start to do that, if you could utilize the chat box and share your thoughts, and if you could number the scenarios, so there's 1 to 6 on the screen, and then myself and Bex know exactly which one you're referring to, and we'll keep an eye on the chat box, and hopefully to keep it nice and interactive, we'll have some conversations around some of your answers in the chat box. So we'll just give you 5 minutes maximum just to go through those scenarios. Tension's building back when we're waiting.
So just try and give as much details as you possibly can. So obviously you've not got your football, so what other equipment might you utilise for scenario 1, for example, as a few people seem to be picking that one out.
So Mark, just as it's coming in the chat box, no, so we don't have any footballs, so you'll have to think outside the box a little bit. That was for scenario 1, I think. Let me try and keep a tab on the chat box, and I can scroll back up and down, Bex.
Yeah, we've got a few answers flying in now.
Yeah. So just reading through from Martin, he's had this a few times. He's now put together some plans that take into account. So that's good. So that'll lead us nicely into some of the stuff we've got. Yeah, so some use of arrival activities. Okay, number 5. Yep, so we're getting some stuff in backs.
Yeah, we've got a nice variety of answers for each scenario as well.
Yeah. Okay. Can you see that better, Bex, now?
What's that, sorry?
Can you see the slides better, or is that just on my...
That's just on yours, we full screened it.
Right, got you. Yeah. Okay. Okay, do you want to introduce the theme back, so I'll keep a tab on the chat box, and we'll get back to those scenarios.
Yeah, so just before we move on, we've just got a little bit of a poll that should be popping up on your screen. So take the opportunity to vote. Just try and pick out which one of the scenarios would you find most challenging. And we're going to try and utilise this to steer some of the conversations as we review these in a second. So hopefully that's popped up on your screen. I can see that a few people are starting to vote.
I'm just going to make some notes back on the chat box.
Yeah, no problem. There seems to be two leading favourites at the minute on this poll. Just give people a few more minutes to complete that if they haven't done already. My maths isn't quite quick enough to work out how many people have voted. We're on about 70 votes at the minute. Yep, so there looks to be two clear winners there, which is scenario 4 and 6. So that was just a bit of a starting activity just to get you thinking about the topic for the evening, which is, of course, developing a what-if plan for training and match day. It was nice to see that someone had written in the chat box that those scenarios were quite real. We've certainly sat together, Dave, and talked through a few scenarios in the past few days about things that have challenged us, that have been thrown in as a bit of a curveball. So we're going to look at some of this stuff this evening. Just to introduce ourselves first, my name's Bex. I am the county coach developer for Manchester, and Dave, who introduced the evening, Dave Morris, he does the same role, but he covers 3 counties: Cumberland, Westmoreland, and the Isle of Man. Yeah, so we're your hosts for this evening. We're going to be with you for around an hour, and these are the objectives for the night. So we're going to try and explore some common scenarios that you might face as coaches during training and match day. But what we want to try and work out is what's some of the stuff that's specific to your own context as well, because you'll all face different things over a number of different in different scenarios. So we want to make it specific to you, and we're going to use 2 main models that are going to help us with this. We're going to use the plan, do, review model, which you'll be familiar with if you've seen any of the England DNA stuff and you've been on any FA education courses recently, and also the STEP principle, which is very often used as part of your planning. And we use it to kind of adapt our sessions as well. I think just before Dave talks through some of the scenario feedback that we've had through, I think it's important to say that on the brief when you signed up for the webinar, it talks about planning for every eventuality. And I don't think we can always plan for every eventuality until it actually happens. So there will always be some stuff that gets thrown at us that we've never experienced before, and that's okay. That happens to all of us. So I think also we can't be there for every what if that's going to be thrown at you. So what we're going to try and do tonight, as well as talking through some examples of how we've dealt with stuff, we're also going to give you a bit of a thought process that might just help you when these scenarios crop up, so that you can deal with them better in the moment, and it'll just help you manage those scenarios as they happen, rather than trying to address and think of them all tonight, because we couldn't possibly think of every single what if that might crop up in your scenario.
Okay, right. So back to the scenarios, and picked up that 4 and 6 from the poll that are your most challenging. So we want to keep this first bit fairly interactive if we possibly can. So we're just going to try something. So I'm going to scroll up from the chat box. So from Andrew Copeland, when we talk about scenario number 6, so that you've been working with a team a number of weeks on playing with a high press. 5 minutes into the game, you can see 2 goals with balls played over the top. And Andrew's put, I would keep going with what we have learnt. Young players will make mistakes, so that leads me to thinking about foundation phase and youth development players. Andrew, do you think, can you try and unmute yourself, or Bex, can we scroll down and unmute Andrew? And if you could elaborate a little bit further, Andrew, on your answer, that'd be fantastic.
I can only see so many attendees. I can't see a full list of everyone.
Okay. So let's have a look. Andrew Copeland. No, yeah, you're right. Okay.
Maybe if Andrew could perhaps expand a little bit in the chat box, that might just.
Yeah. So Andrew, what age group was it that you're working with? Just so we get the context first, if you could put in the chat box for me. But you're right in what you're saying. Young players make mistakes, and we need to allow them to learn from them. So for me, with that number 6, depending on the age phase that you're working in, I would think as a coach, if it's not worked, are we just pressing for the sake of pressing, or do I need to look at what we went through in training and look at maybe some when to press and when not to press, possibly. Because you can't press all the time. However, foundation phase, a lot different. You can probably take out a fair bit of the tactical stuff. So when I'm thinking about that, I'm thinking about more youth development, top end, and professional development phase, probably, with the cues and triggers of when to press. Okay, so yep. So that's a good answer coming in there, Bex, in saying judge success on what they've been doing in training. So I think sometimes we can get carried away with what it looks like on the pitch in the match. So I think that's a good point, an important point where if it's been working in training, to persevere. Andrew's put back in. He works with under 8s. Yeah. So you're dead right, Andrew. With the under 8s, allow them to make mistakes. And possibly get some question and answer to reaffirm their understanding at different points, whether that be a break in the game, at training, or after as a review. Let me just scroll up and try and get on to number 4. So
just on that scenario, Dave, I think we spoke about within training. Do we plan for these what ifs? Because these are the what ifs. So we know that that might be something that's happened just in the game this particular week. That might be the first time that this has happened, or we might start, if we're observing the opposition and what they're trying to do, even though it's not paid off in the last few weeks. It might be something that the opposition have been trying to do for a number of weeks. So how do we incorporate that into our training as a bit of a what if? And in managing the opposition, you might encourage them to use that option without telling the team that you're working with, and then as it crops up, you can kind of help them understand how they might deal with that.
Great stuff. And I think Michael Pitch has given a quick answer into scenario 4, where the 2 players have had a fight in school, and you as the coach have just been told. So again, another what if. And I think that's about knowing your players and knowing then how to want to deal with it. So speak to both players before the game or training, whatever it may be, and get them to discuss and work through the issue. So potentially that could be a good answer. I think if you know your players and the 2 that aren't getting on usually do, then there's a good chance you might be able to work that out. You may have to keep them apart sometimes as well. So I think knowing your players is the key to putting into practice that what if in terms of what you're going to do. But no, that's good. I'll try and get one more from each one back, shall I?
Yeah.
And then we can move on. So Alex has put in the chat box on the same scenario, number 4. Speak to both players together. Find out whether there's a willingness on both sides to play together. So that's spot on. And if that's the case, emphasize the importance of teamwork. So that's a great point. And not letting them follow teammates down, letting their teammates down, should I say. If there is a refusal, this could be done the seriousness of the issue. So I think it goes on then to say, so maybe some meetings thereafter. And I think that's important. Go on, Beck, sorry.
I was just going to say, I think there's an important bit here that, yes, they play for the same team, but what's happened at school yesterday almost needs to be separated from football today. If we can get some insight into how school have dealt with it, it might be already dealt with, or the parents might have already dealt with it. So do we need to bring it up again? So it might be the decision that you take to not even mention it.
Yeah.
Again, knowing the players, or it might be that I think like someone has suggested, you just have a chat with the pair of them, and whether you do that with them both together or whether you choose to do that with them both separately. But I think it's just making sure that this doesn't hang over them into the next day, because that might, they've probably not maybe forgotten about it, but it was yesterday. Today's a new day, and we're going to focus on the game. And it's just an opportunity to kind of move on, really. But there might be some values and stuff that are important, that you might be able to emphasize through that, around respect and things like that when you do speak to them. That would be the way I would take the conversation, and the importance of team and looking after your teammates, rather than almost using that conversation to keep going back over that they shouldn't have done it.
Yeah, makes sense. I think it's important to remember sometimes, I think, as you alluded to earlier, Bex, that maybe the coach can't solve everything.
Yeah.
So is it training and especially if they're on their own, then utilising the parents and friends and the network of the team to help solve the situation as well. Yeah. So just the last one before we wrap this first bit up. I realise we haven't got through everybody's, but we've only got a certain amount of time. So getting on to number 6, Dean has put. So yes, that might happen when they press forward, getting done over the top. Hopefully the players know that there is a possible outcome in terms of that, and so to keep working at it, and then perhaps focus on also the back line. So within that, when we are pressing, what are the responsibilities and roles of the players in a back 3 or back 4, whatever it may be, to not get done over the top. So I think that's an important point as well. Although we're working on pressing from the front, then we've got to affect the whole team. And if that back line are pushed far too up, then you might get done over the top. So I think that was a good point in terms of working with the different units. Okay.
So I had a chat through some of those scenarios, and I'm hoping that there's already some different scenarios from your own context that are starting to pop into your head as we're going through this. Just in terms of moving on to thinking about this as the step principle, and from a step point of view, what you could probably place those scenarios in at least one of these boxes, or the ones that you might be thinking of in your mind. You could probably place it into a specific one of these boxes about which of the main areas does this kind of come under. And I think we've gone through your questions that you submitted as part of signing up. And what we've tried to do is just include in this model some of the stuff that has come out from you. So there was lots of things around numbers of players. And what we started to see as we were reading through them is that actually, yes, it's your numbers is mainly a player issue. It would fall into that box. But that can have an effect on some of the other boxes as well. So it can impact you in terms of space. So some people were saying, I often get large numbers in a very small space. Some other people were saying, I plan for quite a big number, but very often all I get turning up is a smaller number. So that might then impact on the task that you're going to get the players to to do during the session. So they start to have a knock-on effect onto some of the other areas of this step principle. And then you've probably got some general ones that perhaps affect, again, a number of these. So we had the scenario there about the weather. And I guess I had this a few weeks ago, actually, when I went out and did a level 2 in situ visit. I arrived and it was absolutely bouncing down. I saw that a few people put on about trying to use the indoor space. The coach had no indoor space. I think they were girls under 14s or something. So he had his 3G pitch. Luckily, that wasn't flooding yet. It was still playable, and he was just really clever in the way he went about it. And I think that's where the coach is really important. He was just really calm. I think I was probably more worried about it than he was, because I had to sit and watch him. But he was just really calm. The players were kind of coming up to him and, is it still going ahead? The parents were asking him, and really calmly he was like, yeah, we're just going to adapt and we're just going to crack on.
Sorry to interrupt, Bex. Was that from, do you think he's planning beforehand, knowing what might come up, or was he, as we all have to do sometimes, sort of thinking on your feet in action?
I think he thought on his feet, because this weather wasn't really expected.
Yeah.
He thought there might be a slight drizzle, but it turned into a torrential shower, and it went on for about 40 minutes of the session. So all he did was, when I spoke to him at the end, I said, what was you thinking at the start of the session? And he just said, my main aim is just to keep them moving and keep them active. So he'd got a bit of a warm up, and I think he'd got them like doing some stretches and a little bit of passing in pairs with a football. And he straight away he just scrapped that. So he completely went away from his plan, which I thought fair play to him, because he was on an in situ visit, so he was being observed by myself. But he just didn't panic. He just scrapped the first bit, and he just moved into this game related practice that he had, which just kept all of the players active and involved. It was like a bit of a target practice. So he had targets either end. He made sure he kept swapping those targets so that they weren't stood in the rain for too long. So every time the ball was passed into the target, they swapped. So just little things like that. And it was just a quick change. But, it was only when I had that conversation after with him, I didn't even realise he'd scrapped his first bit. So he was so calm, and I think that's where the coach is really important in this stuff, just in terms of their behaviours and emotions. Because if we start to panic and flap and, we're running around trying to work out what it is we're going to do, that's going to have an impact on the players. And it might have an impact on their motivation as well. So if he turns up and he's like, can't be bothered, it's throwing it down, that's going to rub off on the players. So he was really important in that. But we just saw how that weather in general had a massive impact on his players, himself as a coach, and the task, or some of the tasks that he had planned. I think, just to address the one that seemed to come up quite a lot in the questions that came up at the beginning. So you've got a large number of players in a small space. And I think that point around keeping them active and engaged as much as you possibly can is really important. I know there's been a few examples where you've kind of got this space and then you've almost had to join two groups together. So you might have, a game where it's through the thirds and you're using a third of your pitch, and you're splitting that third of your pitch into thirds. And you might have that planned for the evening for 10 players. Suddenly you're faced with maybe 15, 16 players, or maybe even 20. And I think it's just working out, how do you now use that space, but still working on the same topic that you were hoping to work on that evening. So we spoke about sometimes you scrap some stuff from the plan, and that's okay. But if you can stick to the same theme and topic that you were looking to work on. So I know from our skills program days, we used to have to deal with 30 kids on a playground. And, you couldn't have full games, but we wanted to keep it as a game related practice. So rather than so say you've got your third of the pitch and you've split it into thirds, you might just use each third to group your players. And that can help with the ability levels and differentiating stuff. So you might have a group that are forging ahead, you might have a group that are coping, and a group that are striving to keep up. And you might just adapt the game slightly that you were originally going to play. But rather than, in now what you are working in a third of a third, you might have a halfway line in. And if you're working on passing, for example, it's just thinking about in that small space, how are you still going to bring that theme out? So it might be a condition on the game where we say, right, you can only pass into the next half, so you can't dribble, so you must pass into the next half for it to advance up the pitch. It might be number of passes equals number of goals when you eventually score. But if you've had to break your pitch down and break your groups down, you might not even have goals, or you might not have movable goals, which I know is a challenge for some people on their pitch. So again, it's thinking cleverly about what does that scoring system now look like? Because the scoring system still gives us direction to make it game related. But it might be that we add some gates in and they've got to pass through the gate to score. So it's working on the accuracy of their pass. Or it might be an end zone and they've got to pass it in for someone else to run on to receive. So I think it's just trying to stick to your topic, trying to keep them active and engaged, and trying to keep it realistic to something that they would experience in a match. But how do we just tweak it slightly in terms of scoring system, the challenge that we're giving them, just to still bring out that topic and manage those bigger numbers?
I think with that space backs as well, I think sometimes coaches tend to work individually on their own, even if we're on the same 3G and from the same club. So it might be an idea with the person that from the same club, for example, working on the next third, that two coaches could come together. So if you're struggling with bigger numbers or smaller numbers, rather than trying to adapt the plan, it might be that you can come together, work on that same theme. Then that obviously gives you the bigger space and more numbers, depending. And I think if it's done effectively, so if myself and you were working next to each other, then one of us could work on some in possession, and one of us could work out of possession. So we're sort of collaborating together as well.
So I just think it's when you're trying to identify where some of these problems sit, try and just identify which area of the step model they sit in, or is it a more general issue, and then what impact might it have on those other areas. But I think then, as we know, when we talk on courses, this model can also help us to just adapt to some things as well. And if something's not working, the players, you've got a brilliant session planned out that you really think looks like it's going to work brilliantly on paper, and the players just don't get it. Is it just something that you need to tweak about the task, or how you've explained the task in terms of your communication? And usually with these what ifs that are thrown at us, sometimes it's a bigger tweak that we need to make, but very often it's just a slight tweak. I think this step principle can really help.
I think on the task as well, just so it's so we can sort of follow it to training and games as well. I thought earlier that sometimes for all the best laid plans, a what if might be that training's cancelled before the game that week. So it might be that you train on a Thursday and you play on a Saturday morning, so that you don't have that time to work with your players on a Thursday prior to a game. So that what if might be then, can we utilise maybe some social media? So I know a lot of coaches use WhatsApp to engage with the parents if it's particularly foundation phase. I know at the club that I coach, youth development phase, that's used quite a bit. So if you don't get a chance to train that week, whether it be weather or pitch availability, or it might be thinking of other ways of engaging the players. It might be some player recall with what you've been working on, that theme or block. It also might be that you give the ownership to the players prior to the game, for them to come up with some ideas as well. So sometimes we have to think, and if we can't do something that we've been doing, how do we utilise the stuff that we use at our club or a particular club to help you with those what ifs sometimes.
Yeah, I think with that, I know that if you've got that parent group, it might be that you can drop in some potential challenges that you're going to challenge the players with in the match day, so they have them ahead of the game, and they can just have a think about some stuff. You might challenge them to watch some live matches if they can, and just pick out some examples of a player that does that really well, and how might that look in the game at the weekend. I think then it's important that you readdress that when you get to the game, and that could, I think we had a question that came through when people signed up about, do we refresh some stuff when we're warming up on match day? And absolutely, I think one of the best things I learned on a course I went on recently was, you might even repeat your planned practice as the warm up for match day if you've got the space to do that, and just set up a mini version of the practice that you would have used or that you have used, and get them working on that as part of the warm up. Yeah, and then you can start to just feed in these messages.
Just to come in back, so there's Reece Barker put in the chat box. So along the lines of what we've just been talking about, utilising different social media platforms, set up a Google Drive and give the players tasks to do from what the session was on that theme, uploading some session plans to give players the chance to recall. So that's really good for them visually as well. And I think it's being effective for those older age groups. So definitely, professional development phase, so 17 and 21s, that's something that they could really take on board, and you get some really good detail as well.
Yeah. Just on the tactics and strategy stuff as well, we spoke about it a little bit before. Something I found useful for my own planning as a coach is, when you're planning a particular topic or theme, again, just try and watch some live footage of the game. And, I plan what ifs from a tactics and strategy point of view into my planning. So we're going to try and do this as a team, but what if the opposition do this? So we're going to try and play out from the back, but what if the opposition presses really high and they stop us from doing that? Or it might be that we're going to try and play out from the back through our holding midfield player. Again, what if the opposition just kind of mark that player out of the game? Mm-hmm. So trying to just plan ahead and think about, if you're coming up with a tactic to do something in the game, what potentially could the opposition do to counteract that? Because that's what football is, isn't it? It's a bit like we make this move and then the opposition do this, and suddenly we've got to adapt. So building some of that stuff into your planning for training, and throwing some of these curveballs in, getting the opposition in, right, this is what I want you to do now, or how might we approach this situation to make the opposition less effective.
I think as well, game scenarios in training can have a help with the what ifs for the weekend. So maybe that you've had a player sent off or two players sent off, you're down, or numbers haven't turned up and you're a few players down. And even if it's sort of a freak scoreline, if you like, which you might well get foundation phase, you can still work on those what ifs at training with game scenarios, so that when that does happen, it's not necessarily a shock to the system for the players on the field, and you as a coach are helping them deal with that as well. Yeah,
definitely. Has anyone just got any other questions, or they're looking at this and there's an issue that's really sticking in their mind that they'd like us to just have a chat through as an example of how we might use this model to help us? If you just drop it in the chat box. just picking up on a point that's just come in, that's a great way to use your assistant coach or a co-coach that you're working with, get them to manage the opposition. It's happened to me a few times with the guy I coached this year. So we set something up, but he doesn't tell me what he's going to do, and it challenges me, and it puts you on the spot. But you get to feel what the players face every week.
Yeah,
something being thrown at them that we might not have practiced. And it's always refreshing to hear how they explore that and come up with a solution. Has anyone got any other scenarios?
I think you made a good point back earlier in part of the training, maybe getting some of the team to play how the opposition might play. So a certain style of play to play against. So it might be, for example, trying to beat a block, anything like that, which you can utilise throughout the age phases as well. So what does it look like at foundation phase beating a block? Was it at youth development phase and professional development?
Yeah, definitely. So we'll move on. We obviously spoke in the introduction about how we're going to try and give you some stuff to help you. And this is where you can utilise the plan, do, review model. So we've just got a list of questions, and the way we're going to do it is where Dave's going to almost ask me the questions, and I'm just going to share how I would utilise this thought process for a challenge that I've been having throughout the season, really. Before we do that, though, if you just think about that top question and just pause for a moment to reflect on what things regularly happen that really challenge you in your own coaching. There's probably a couple of things that spring to mind straight away, but just take some time to reflect on what things regularly happen that challenge you.
Right, shall I kick off the questioning, Bax?
Yeah.
So can you give us an example then, Bax, of what regularly, or what's a challenge that regularly happens, and how might you manage that? So
the challenge I've had is, and I think it popped up in some of the questions that came in when they signed up, was about player. I've got one player in particular that is late, mainly on match days. I say mainly on match days. It probably happens evenly in training and match days, but we probably see the impact more on match day because you're trying to prep for the game and you're panicking about whether she's going to be there in time for kickoff or not.
Yeah. So that's happened on a regular basis. Have you come up with a strategy for managing that, and how has it gone?
I think the first point is just linking back into the traffic light scenario that we've just put on there. So in terms of this traffic light system, when you're thinking of these challenges that might crop up, it's thinking about the likelihood of it. So red, it rarely happens. Amber, it sometimes happens. Green, it happens a lot. Or you might flip the colours the other way around, however you want to work it. So for me, this lateness is green. It's very likely that it's going to happen. And this is where, if it's a one-off, I probably don't need to think about it. I don't need to really plan for it because it might happen once every 10 or 12 weeks. And we just deal with it as and when. But because it is a regular occurrence, this is something that I've now started to work into my planning. So when I'm planning for match day, I've got that in my mind, and I've got it noted down about something that I need to prep for.
Yeah.
In terms of that traffic light system, severity is quite a harsh word, but we mean by that the severity of the impact. And I think this links into how I've tried to deal with it. So we spoke on the previous slide about the coach behaviours and their emotions and their values. Now, I've gone this season with, having worked particularly in women's football at open age, I recognise that football isn't the most important thing for them. They've probably got families, which a lot of ours have. They've got jobs. They've got other stuff that's going on. So football's important, but it's not always as important as some of the other stuff to them. So I have some level of understanding that they are going to be late from time to time. And, there's going to be times where they can't be there or they can't get there in time. So I try and go in with that understanding approach and be empathetic towards it. I think it's important that people are on time. But I always try and have some understanding of why, first of all, people might be late. So I've gone in with the approach of understanding, but in terms of severity of impact, the longer it's gone on and the more it's happened, I'm starting to recognise the effect it's having on the players.
Yeah.
And there's an element of, well, that's not fair because Bex, you ask us to get there at 1:00 for a 2:00 kickoff, but each week that particular player isn't turning up on time. So it's become a bit of a balance in terms of how I deal with it. And at first it was okay to just be understanding and don't worry about it. I get it. You've been at work, you've had a busy day, you've had other stuff going on. But now the severity of impact on the players is starting to build. I'm having to think about how I might manage it in a different way.
Does that look any different backs from training on a match day? Because obviously they're probably easier to engage the players on a training evening or night. How do you keep them engaged when it's that match day situation and obviously there's a little bit more focus on a player not turning up on time?
Yeah, I think we just, the players now know that we just crack on with stuff, and I think they trust that I'll deal with it. And what we've kind of agreed now is that, and this is for all the team, if you are going to be late, all I ask is that you let me know. And that when you arrive to training, you make the effort to apologise to your teammates. It came to a bit of a head. I think it was our last game before lockdown, actually. And this particular player, the nearer it got to kick off, the players are going, like, where is she? Because we only had 11 that day. So the fact that she wasn't there, the players were starting to panic. And again, those coach behaviours, it was just us trying to stay positive. And what we had was a plan of, because we anticipated that this is likely to happen in terms of the likelihood, we'd already come up with a formation of if her or someone isn't there on time, this is the formation we'll go with just 10. And what we tried to do was we tried to keep it consistent for the players. So we always approach the game. We said to our players, try and almost don't let them come out of their half. So try and keep them in there, keep the opposition in their half. So it was the same approach, but we just knew that we went with the back three, and we just almost lost someone from the back unit until she arrived. So it was still that same approach. So it was consistent, and I think the players started to feel more comfortable with that. And then it was passing on the message that we trust them. You're really good at this. We do this well. We always start the game well when we ask you to do this. So just do exactly what you've always done. And then it'll be a bonus when she arrives because it'll feel like you've got an extra player.
Mm-hmm. How do you find managing the players when that player did turn up? Were the other players, or have they been supportive, or did some of them are they getting frustrated and annoyed? And how do you manage that?
I think as she ran on, she was kind of apologising to those that were around her. I think she actually scored in that game as well, which helped because the players were. And they almost kind of made a joke of, well, you owed us that one kind of thing. But I guess that's the approach we've gone. We try and keep it humorous if we can, because she is a bit of a character. She is still respected by the players, and she's a good player. So we've got to manage it. But yeah, it was definitely a buzz. And I think at half time it was important just to speak to the players about how well we'd actually done in those initial first 5-10 minutes, you know, we didn't concede, and we did really well with that. And then obviously it just gave us an extra boost when she arrived to the game.
Yeah, and to the players, have they got an understanding of sort of the reasons or anything like that? So, what's the context for that player in terms of why they turn up late?
I think they do acknowledge. I think she's got about 3 jobs that she works, so you know there is an element of understanding there, and I think that's been important for us to encourage the players to, you know, our understanding and empathy has rubbed off on some of the other players, so they do understand. So I think, yeah, it's, I guess, reviewing it now, we spoke before when we were chatting about this stuff, because it is such a regular occurrence. It's almost, well, where are you going with it next? And I think the more it starts to frustrate the players, even though they do try and understand, you know, when it's a regular thing from the same player. But I think this is where now we almost have to get them to hold the player accountable rather than just us as the coaches, you know. And if the captain and the players start sharing perhaps their frustrations and, you know, the impact that it's having on them and them in the game, then if it's coming from the players, it might have a different impact on her than rather than us dealing with it.
Yeah, definitely. So I suppose you've had a bit of time to review it during lockdown. So is there anything that from when it's happened before that you might do differently? And can you talk us through sometimes maybe your thought process in how you review it and then put it back into action?
Yes, I just think it's been a constant trial and error of trying different ways in which you approach the conversation. So, and I think this is the same with everything. You've just got to, you're not probably going to get the solution straight away. And, you know, I'd love to meet anyone who does, because I certainly never do. There's always something that I would have done differently to manage the situation. But sometimes it's just trial and error over a period of time. Get to know the individual, get to understand them, try and have some empathy with them, but just try and put some things in place as a bit of a compromise. So I know that I can't stop her from being late because I can't control that. She controls when she gets there.
Yeah.
What I can do is I can perhaps influence it when she does get there. So again, letting me know that she's running behind, and then just obviously speaking with the players when she arrives, and then you know, what's her mindset when she does arrive? Is she ready? Is she ready to play?
I'm just looking through the chat box, and it seems that
there's quite a few come through, hasn't there, different scenarios.
So I suppose it all depends sometimes on the age phase as well. So I think there's people that have said that they might have to stay on the bench. I think it's important that we get that context, as Deborah's put, the reason why, how many times it happens. And I suppose it goes back to your coach's values and philosophy. So the team might have that rule in place anyway as a club.
Yeah.
You know, if you're late X amount of times, then you do start on the bench. So if that's accepted by the players, then that's completely fine. But I think that certainly might apply to older end youth development phase and definitely professional development phase. Foundation phase, we might have to look at that a little bit differently, because it might not be the players' fault, it might be the parents, especially foundation phase.
Just looking through a couple of things that have come through. I guess we were going to shift into some questions anyway. So as they're coming through, so small space next to a coach that looks after an older age group. Can you mix? I guess it depends the difference between the age groups. You know, I think players can play up a year, but I'd be careful with that one. But that comes down to knowing your players and what they're capable of. But I think just considering the safety element within that. One coming about, you're 5 goals down in under 15 minutes. What do you say to the players? It's a tough one, isn't it? And just trying to keep them motivated. But I think that's where you spoke about with your 14s, Dave. Your games are split into quarters, aren't they?
Yeah. So especially with the quarters, the game tends not to get away from you so much sometimes. So you can have that interaction with the players, whether it be a question and answering, whether it be around the tactics board, whether it's discussions around what we're not doing so well if we're conceding a lot of goals and how we might go about changing. When it's 2 halves, it's a lot more difficult because you can't really go and affect the play because obviously you can't get on the pitch. So I think the key to the sort of freak scorelines and the what ifs is, again, as I said earlier, planning for as much in training as you can. So those game scenarios. So getting the players to understand, look, if you are 5-0 down, how are you going to play the next 5-10 minutes?
Yeah.
Do you work with some more specific targets and goal setting with players? So can we see it through the next 10 minutes with conceding less goals? And I think as well, not just getting beat heavily, but also if you're the coach and the manager that has scored maybe 5 or 6 goals in that short amount of time. So it's probably no fun for the players if the game's too easy. So can you as a coach put some conditions or some constraints on your players? And I know in foundation phase, obviously they've got the sort of power plays and you can add players to keep that scoreline down. I suppose it's a question, do we as coaches do that when we're winning a lot? Not just looking to change things and do things differently if we're getting beat.
Yeah. And it's just, I think he's at Huddersfield now. There was an FA Cup game, and the manager, he was at Lincoln, wasn't he? I can't remember who they played in the FA Cup, but he talked about chunking the game, and they said, right, we're going to try and keep the first 15 minutes as a draw, and then, how many of those 15 minutes can we keep level? And then once they went behind, it was like, right, can we win the next 15 minutes? Or can we draw the next 15 minutes? So that the idea of chunking, it just helped to give the players a focus rather than focusing on the overall score.
Yeah.
Just a couple of others I'm picking out. So 2, and I guess this is a massive problem that crops up a lot. So you've always got your copers, which are a larger group. The majority fall within that group, but then you'll have 2 that are striving ahead, or 1 or 2, and then 1 or 2 that are struggling to keep up. And just trying to work out how you manage that in your sessions, because it can challenge us as coaches to try and accommodate all that spectrum of ability, can it? And I guess that we talked about groupings, and just this is where you might just work out who you're going to pair or group with who. And if you might put the 2 that are striving ahead against each other, but if you need more numbers, you might just use some of the copers, that you could split your copers into those that are at the top end of coping and those at the lower end of coping. So the top end copers who might be pushing into striving ahead, you could probably group with some of your ones that are striving ahead, maybe.
Yeah.
I think that's the best way I've found to manage it.
And I think the key is knowing your players. So if you maybe group your players around the 4 corners, as you said, so you might know the social groups, you might know maybe the physical size and differences, so you can mix and match them. So you might pair them up physically to get them coping. Or the next week, as you say, you might play a big one against a little one, depending on how that works. But grouping them in the 4 corners is a good sort of go-to. if you're in the middle of a session and something happens. So what if the tempo is not right, or what if then they're not sort of at it in the training as you like them to be? Then changing those groups could possibly have an impact on the training.
Yeah, definitely. Another one that I saw as I was scrolling through, players almost having an emotional outburst during matches. I'm sure we've all experienced it, where players just have this emotional outburst, and I've known players to walk off the pitch, or I've known them to just stop playing completely, or they might go on a bit of a rampage and just have a mad 5 minutes where they're flying in with tackles. I think the emotional bit is really challenging, and it can just happen. It can be something in the game that just triggers it, and again, it comes down to knowing the player and knowing the individual. Have they got the skills to be able to calm themselves down and regulate those emotions, or is it that they just need almost 5 minutes as a cool off period? We bring them off the pitch, but I think that conversation that we have with them is really important. And again, the importance of our own behaviours. Try and stay as calm as we can. Almost help them to understand that these emotions are okay, and separate the player from the behaviour. So the emotions are okay, and it's okay to feel this way, but that behaviour isn't something that is allowed on a football pitch, or isn't something that we want to see on a football pitch. So you're separating the emotions. So the emotion's okay, and we're going to help you understand that, and almost give you some strategies to calm yourselves down if this happens again.
Yeah.
Because what we can't see is the behaviour when this happens. So we need to find a way of calming ourselves down so that we can we see different behaviours, and just working through it with the player rather than almost just focusing on their behaviour and telling them that's not acceptable, and what are you doing, why are you walking off, get back on the pitch, you can't do this, you're in a that doesn't help the situation.
No.
We need to try and help them manage that emotion and help them understand what it is that's got them so emotional, so if it happens again, they might be able to manage it better next time.
Should we whiz on to the next slide? I'm just conscious a little bit of time. It's getting near that 7 o'clock. So I suppose just to help give it an overview, if you like, of what we've been talking about. So I think looking at the importance of planning, the more you can plan, the less the what ifs become sometimes. So I think the importance of planning and reviewing and keeping that cycle going is really important to developing the responses that we can give to what if scenarios, but not being too rigid that we only stick to that plan. So be prepared to come off it and think on your feet a little bit sometimes. I think to reassure coaches that, as we said at the top of the webinar, you can't plan for everything. So not to panic, and the importance, again, going back to the reviewing. Once it happened, how did I deal with it? If it does happen again, then I'm in a better place. And finally, looking at prevention over cure, thinking about coaching behaviours. So when something does happen, what are you as the coach? What's your response? So it's important to stick to your values and beliefs, be consistent, as I think Bex mentioned earlier, and to keep yourself calm. So do we, as coaches, are we able to step back if something out of our controls happened, that what ifs happened? How do we deal with that in our coach behaviours? Do we go? Does it affect us? Can the players see that, or are you able to stand back and almost, if you like, count to 5, count to 10 before you put something into action to deal with it? But knowing your players is always the key to managing those what ifs. So you know how to treat certain players. Some might need an arm around the shoulder. So the old saying, some might need a telling off. You've got to know your players, and it obviously depends on the situation and the age phase and that context. And I think really important that we've touched on tonight as well, linking training into match days. So training plays a big part in planning for your what ifs on a match day. And if you can give the players, I suppose, the tools to be able to cope with either getting beat heavily or using some constraints in games if it's too easy for your players, I think that's important that you use them in training so that it's not a shock to the system, as I said earlier, when it happens on a match day, and the players and yourselves as coaches can deal with it a little bit better.
Just a quick point that's just come in from someone around when we group players into forging ahead, striving to keep up, coping. Obviously, we don't let the players know that that's the group that they're in. It's just us in our minds and in our plans.
Yeah.
What slight tweak of task we're going to give each group. So they're playing the same game. They just might have a slightly different task, or they're obviously playing up against different opposition and with different players in the team. So that's important to manage as well.
Yeah.
But that's for us to manage, and we know that stuff, but the players don't necessarily have to.
Yeah, I think just keep it on that as well, and it's maybe a question the attendees can ask themselves after the webinar. We spend a lot of time talking about what ifs things go wrong, but what if things are going flying? How do you then challenge those players, as we were saying in the striving group, and how do you keep them motivated? Not just planning for the what ifs that are negative and that might sort of derail what you've got planned. Also, it can be equally as effective if the players aren't being challenged. So what do we do? What if everything's brilliant, everyone's flying in the session, everyone's picking up some learning points? How do I, as a coach, then push them that little bit further?
Yeah, great point. And I think that's pretty much it for the evening. Just to let you know, if you click on the handouts that should be on your screen, there should be an option to click on handouts. We've dropped the PDF of the slides in for you so that you've got a copy of those. So I think I've just noticed a couple of people have said about some of the stuff being useful in terms of that thought process. So you've got a copy of the handouts if you want to refresh back on some of this stuff. And that's pretty much it. Unless anyone's got any further questions that they want to drop into the chat box, any final scenarios, we'll stick around for a couple of minutes and just answer anything that comes through about the what ifs. It looks like Pete Sturge is taking over the platform at 7, so if people need to shoot to hear that legend speak, then crack on.
Have we got another slide to consolidate, Max, on the last bit for those that are still tuning in? So I've done. There you go.
Yeah. So just as you're reflecting on this tonight, think about some what ifs that are specific to your context, and now you've got that thought process to work through. I know it's difficult to try and put any of this into practice when we can't get out there physically on the pitch and coach, but if there is some things that have consistently cropped up across the season, what are your what ifs, and how are you going to plan for and adapt to them moving forwards using that thought process? And then just have a think about 2 things that you're going to do differently as a result of this workshop.
Great stuff. Yeah, I think people are dropping out now, Bex, so it's that time of night.
Yeah. Yeah, so thanks very much, Dave. Thanks for joining us.
Pleasure. It's been enjoyable.
And thanks to everyone for giving up their Wednesday evening. Is it Wednesday? Yeah, and missing out on a barbecue, probably, with this lovely weather. Take care, everyone, and stay safe.
Bye.